Good day to you all, and welcome to this Friends of Multilateralism group interview series, MC12 and Beyond. My name is Xiankun Lu. I'm the CEO of FMG, and which focus on WTO reform. And today we have the honor to have our FMG member and former director of WTO Service and Investment Division, Mr. Hamid Mamdouh, with us, and we will talk about one key issue for the WTO reform. And thanks a lot, Hamid. Welcome to be with us.
Pleasure.
The first thing I want to say is that we do see the WTO MC12 Ministerial Conference 12 has delivered something on WTO reform. Is the paragraph 3 of the outcome document, which basically says 4 things. First, acknowledge the need to address the challenges for the WTO and ensure its proper function. The second thing is that to establish a commitment for necessary reforms of the WTO and to improve all its functions. And third, the process should be solid, member-driven, open, transparent, inclusive, and must address the interests of all members, including developing members' interests. And the last one, of course, is the institution. It is said that the General Council and its subsidiary bodies will conduct the work and, as appropriate, submit any decisions to next ministerial conference, hopefully in about 2 years. So, Hamid, what's your evaluation of this outcome, and what's your impression?
Well, thank you once again, Lou, for having me on this interview. I think this has been a very, very significant step forward by WTO members to address a long-standing priority, which I would consider actually the highest long-term priority for the system. Because for several years now, about 6 years at least, world leaders, whether in the G20 or in other groupings, regional or otherwise, have been talking about necessary WTO reforms. The WTO has been of critical importance to the world economy. And for some time now, the WTO has been suffering from a lot of serious challenges. Now, WTO reform discussions have been taking place almost everywhere, except in the WTO. Of course, there were proposals here and there on notifications, on starting WTO reform discussions, so forth, but there has not been a structured process devoted to WTO reform. So this is a very, very significant step forward. Now, having said that, what it means really is that we're just getting through a gate beyond which we're going to face a multitude of challenges, a multitude of issues in a very, very different world from that in which the WTO was created. So many things have happened. And if we look at what we need to do, I know what you said about the ministerial outcome document and the elements it contains. And I think it contains the sort of necessary elements to start to go through that gate. We need to address the challenges. We need to ensure the proper functioning of the WTO, which is very important, because here we're talking about concrete things. The functioning of the WTO is basically about the core functions of the WTO, and there's 3 of them that are of vital importance. That's why the system was created. We can unpack that a little bit as we go in this conversation. And then, of course, there is the reaffirmation of the foundational principles, which is terribly, terribly important. And all these things have been referred to in very general terms, in very rhetorical terms. So now is the time to unpack them. And this is why this conversation is very timely. I would note, in addition to what you said, the footnote to that paragraph in the outcome document which basically clarifies that paragraph 3 that was adopted on WTO reform does not prevent different groups of members to have conversations in small groups to discuss certain issues or to make certain submissions or so forth. And this kind of variable geometry in a conversation like this is going to be terribly important in order to achieve progress going forward. So let me stop here. And then I think at the beginning of this conversation, it's also important to have a little bit of a diagnostic view about the kind of problems we're trying to solve. So that might shed some light on the way forward in WTO reform discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Hamid, especially for bringing that footnote into the conversation. Because as we understand that WTO reform is so comprehensive and touches upon various aspects of all its three functions. So which means that some members may wish to go forward on some aspects, but some other members may have different view. So that footnote gives the flexibility for different members with different configuration to move ahead in a smaller group, but to test the water and see how it goes, and then bring back to the the more inclusive process, and to see whether anything could happen there. I think that's a very key point. The other thing I want to mention probably is that you're right that albeit is only 4 points, very general, but it touches upon all the key things. But the thing is that we know EU is very much behind this WTO reform process. And last year, October, EU did table a proposal, which from my point of view is much more detailed. And it talks about not only the need, the challenges, but also quite prescriptive in terms of the details of each pillar. So monitoring and deliberative function talks about to improve the monitoring role of the WTO, effectiveness of the committees, and arrangements on relations with stakeholders, so on and so forth. And then it also gives some points on negotiating function as well as dispute settlement here. And it talks about a specific working group instead of what we have now is still the Euro Institution General Council. And it also talks about a more imminent timeline to have tax-bed negotiations no later than January 2023, and then to issue recommendations for MC12 well in advance. So those are the things which are not probably here contained. So compare the two. What do you think needs to happen? And that so we could have more details, not necessarily everything on EU's proposal, but to have more details and more deliverables, hopefully in the next 2 years.
I think as a start, the difference is very marginal, if any, because once members at the ministerial level agreed to start this conversation, the conversation would have its own dynamics as it goes forward. I mean, if we look at previous experiences in negotiations over the past 40 years, even before the WTO, you need that kind of mandate commitment to start the process. How it unfolds and what kind of tools will be used, this is going to be a process that, of course, would be faithful to the purpose for which it was installed, but also it will have its own organic dynamics as it goes forward. And I believe that all the details that we found in the EU proposal will necessarily come into this conversation. And I believe there are certain things that need to be clarified. So, for example, from my point of view, I would start with the most existential question about the common purpose from this system. Now, we need to start with that. We need to reaffirm the common purpose. Why is everybody here? And the common purpose, as it is expressed in the Marrakesh Agreement, as well as all other agreements, is that we believe, everybody believes that trade is terribly important. Everybody believes also that for trade to flourish and produce the kind of prosperity and inclusiveness for everyone else, and there needs to be predictability and stability of trade and cross-border business conditions. And we all also believe that in order to ensure that stability and predictability, we need a rules-based system, not a power-based system. So if we all believe in that, then that's all a good starting point. How do we achieve that? It's through the vital functions of the organization. Absolutely, the three vital functions. The first function that is talked about so frequently is dispute settlement, and this is terribly important. It needs to be fixed because this is what gives the WTO also its particular legal character. And then there is the negotiating function, and it has specific problems. The negotiating function has been damaged for quite some time now, I would say since 2008. And there are specific issues that need to be addressed of institutional nature, not in terms of specific negotiating files like fishery subsidies or agriculture or services. No, these are specific negotiating files. But there are institutional challenges that have been holding the negotiating function back. We can come to that in a minute. And then there's the third function, which is so often forgotten and referred to in different terms, which is what I would call the monitoring and implementation function. I mean, I called it previously the collective oversight function. Why has the WTO agreement created those councils and committees? The first purpose is to oversee the functioning of agreements. And there you have notifications, you have cross notifications, which is terribly important. You have the monitoring function in terms of monitoring implementation. You have the deliberative function, which is terribly important, so that members can bring to the table anything they want to discuss. A very good example is the e-commerce work program when it started, not now, because the e-commerce work program started off very well. There's a lot of good work that was done then, but then it sort of subsided for political reasons, and then it was crowded out by the negotiating function and the Doha round and all this. But anyway, all these are important things that any kind of serious conversations would have to look at. Now, what do we do about these things? Now, of course, what you see in in this ministerial outcome is that the discussion about those elements was deferred to the actual process. And I think that was the best thing that can happen, because you cannot pre-negotiate what exactly you would want to do under each of those elements. That has to be part of the process itself. But once, as I said, we cross that gate, then we need to take a careful look at what problems are we trying to solve. Of course, people would have different views. Part of the narrative that was there for years now is that, oh, WTO reform is difficult because it means different things to different people. But of course, that's why we need reform, because it means different things to different people. And now is the time to try and build those bridges that would create the common ground. Now, here, it might not be a bad idea just to take a glimpse at the history and just have a quick diagnostic view of what happened to the system. The WTO started off very well, and then it sort of deteriorated. And now it has reached a point of critical existential challenge. We started from 2008, since the financial crisis. We saw three phenomena that actually challenged the system. The first, and here this is not really criticism to anyone or any country, but the first was the leadership crisis, the leadership deficit. in the system. And by leadership, it's not just political leadership that we have seen from the US since the Second World War, but it's also thought leadership about the political vision or where the system should go, and how do we maintain the system so it continues to update itself and functions well. So that's the first thing. The second challenge, Lou, and this is going to be, I think, increasing as we go, is the increasing complexity of trade policy issues. You know, all those questions of trade and trade and health, trade and environment, trade and privacy, trade and cybersecurity, and we see that what came to the trading sphere and to the trade policy and trade negotiating world is a host of new issues that were driven by, you know, technological advances and innovative business models, which created a lot of new situations, which gave rise to regulatory responses that were, in many instances, overly restrictive. And that put to the trade negotiating community the big challenge of how do you strike a balance between regulatory sovereignty and facilitating cross-border and cross-jurisdictional trade. That increasing complexity, combined with the failure in the negotiating function and the failure in the deliberative function to discuss these issues and see, okay, what could be, you know, the right ways forward, that made this problem get worse and worse as we go forward. The third and last point here in terms of the challenges is that over the years, particularly since 2008, we started seeing that the common purpose behind the system is no longer common, which is, this is why I started off by saying, can we reaffirm the common purpose, why we were here, the stability and predictability of trade through negotiated, you know, legal obligations and all this. You put these three things together and say, all right, these challenges started since 2008 and now we're in 2022, and things have been getting worse throughout. So what do we need to do? Now, that might shed some light on, okay, where can we find some solutions to some of those problems which would actually improve the health of the system and make it serve members better?
Yeah, Hamid, thanks a lot. Just to quickly pick out 2 points here. The first is that the common purpose is no longer the purpose. That actually contributes partially to this leadership process, because we still see among major members one criticizing the other of unilateralism, and the other criticizing this one of a non-market economy, and then so on and so forth. So that creates a lot of things of this leadership vacuum. The second thing is about this complexity of the trade issues and trade and plus and trade and climate change and so on and so forth, which actually is going on very much plurilaterally and under these joint statement initiatives. Of course, members have different views, especially some developing members are trying to balance that with what we call traditional issues, Doha, agriculture subsidies, so on and so forth. So I think that probably needs to be balanced. But one question I want to also touch upon is about this institutional aspect, because as you say, that the dynamics will be there and everything will come into the discussion. But we need to have a proper institution, and that would be focusing on the WTO reform. Right now, the EU proposal say that let's do a working group, and then the outcome say that the General Council and its subsidiary bodies will do this. For me personally, the General Council has its agenda, traditional agenda at times, quite some every time, and the subsidiary bodies likewise. And so, which means that how do we properly arrange the discussion so as you have a focused, kind of really bring into dynamics around WTO reform instead of putting it as one agenda item, which probably, from my point of view, would dilute kind of the quality or the focus of the discussion. What do you think? Anything we could do there, the minister could do there, or the ambassador could do there, to establish a kind of arrangement to help achieve a more focused and high quality discussion. Yeah.
I think you're right. Let me comment first on your first point, which is the common purpose, and then I'll come to the dynamics of the process discussion on reforms. The common purpose, it has been shaken a bit, because one of the phenomena that we've seen over the past 27 years of the life of the WTO is the evolution, not only in the complexity of trade policy issues, as I said, but also in the evolution of the membership of the WTO. And the membership of the WTO has evolved in two directions, or in two respects. One is the increasing numbers, which sometimes makes agreement more difficult, as you know. But the other is the increasing diversity among WTO members in terms of economic models, in terms of trade policy approaches, in terms of approaches to other policies, be it social policies or development or whatever. That sort of organic increasing diversity among membership has created a new picture, very, very different from the picture against which the WTO was created, 30 years ago. It's a very different situation now. And this also led to some members thinking maybe that the system should play a different role, or maybe the system is not serving their interests the way it was supposed to. That's a mix of complex substantive issues, but also very important political issues. There are questions of political vision here involved. And this is why I think this whole process of discussion of WTO reform needs to be addressed with a lot of intellectual clarity and political courage, if I may say, to see where do we want to go, and what do we want out of this system. Do we agree that we need a system? And second, if we do, then how do we make it work? So this is the point about explaining a bit why the common purpose has been shaken, mainly because of the increasing diversity among members. And in the meantime, we have not updated the rule book. Now, you might ask me, okay, in the face of increasing diversity, what could be the solutions? I would say there is no one size fits all for all problems, but as a matter of general principle, as a matter of systemic vision, I think with increasing diversity, what you need is increasing corresponding level of variable geometry in how the system functions in order to cater for different groups of members. And it will have to be a mix of convergence and coexistence elements together. It cannot be one without the other. And that is going to be defining discussions with respect to how do we proceed in different areas. And this idea of variable geometry is not about fragmentation of the system. It's about making the system cater for different levels of diversity. And if I may add a point here, Lou, the WTO system was never defined to be a one-speed system. No, never. Otherwise, we would not have had principles like special and differential treatment, particular consideration for LDCs, and so forth. And these are the big categories, but even within those categories, there is variable geometry elements in order to cater for the priorities and concerns of different members. So this is going to be, I think, a very, very critical element that would permeate a lot of items to be discussed under WTO reform. So this is your first point about common purpose. Regarding an institutional arrangement for discussions, one of the reasons why I highlighted this footnote is because it makes it clear that the there will have to be discussions in different configurations. You can never, ever have a proper discussion of everything in a room with 164 delegations, right? This is going to be actually in itself. I mean, there's something almost poetic about this process in terms of, this process is about repairing the negotiating function, among other things, among the other two functions. It's about repairing the negotiating function, but this process in itself is a negotiating process. So maybe the first practical exercise of repairing the negotiating function is to make this negotiation on WTO reform work well. And the first way, one of the first things to make it work well is to see what works in which situation and try to create common ground through clarifying positions, not through holding back conversations. And here I would have to say that make a point about consensus and the way consensus is being used in the system. I think consensus is and will continue to be the only workable decision-making method in the WTO. The problem is not with consensus in principle. The problem we have been facing is the abuse of consensus. Using consensus or requiring consensus where it is not legally required, where it's not required for a decision to be taken. Now, if we start looking at this in a pragmatic way and allowing different groupings of members to discuss and be transparent about what they're discussing and come back to the collective membership with what has been discussed and what has transpired and all this, I think this is going to go a very, very long way in clarifying the issues, but also in fostering trust. You encourage trust when you're transparent and when you're straightforward in what you want to achieve. And this cloud of mistrust, I think we need to deal with it in the most sincere way possible going forward. So in terms of the institutional arrangements, I would not exclude at all that under the auspices of the General Council, there would be. The chair of the General Council has always had the habit of assigning facilitators. So you can have a facilitator that continues discussion on dispute settlement, another facilitator on the negotiating function and the challenges facing the negotiating function and what elements members can consider or should consider to reform it. On the regular functions of regular bodies, you can have a third facilitator. All this, we've done this before. Actually, this is how we reach this outcome in this ministerial, by assigning facilitators. If you don't do that, then good luck.
Yeah, and also other than facilitators, there's probably also a kind of what we call a dedicated session, so that you separate this probably from the normal WTO General Council and the subsidiary body regular terms, and then so you could have a focused discussion. But I like one thing you said very much. WTO is 25 years old, and it should evolve with its political vision. I remember when I was 25 years old, I was discussing seriously with my wife about marriage and have babies. So I think WTO should seriously, especially the major players, should think about a matured relationship among themselves, collaboration, and deliver babies. I hope that would come. So the other thing I want to say, probably also as your conclusion remark, is about looking ahead. What would be your message about what the minister ambassadors should do to make sure that the next step of WTO reform discussion could deliver and then bring real things as we are discussing here? Hamid, please.
That's a very good question, Lou, and I would start by a comment on your conversation when you were 25. with your wife, because I think, and I think I've said that before many times, I really, really believe that the key to any successful, happy relationships is not so much about what we agree on, but it's about how we deal with our differences. Because we will always have differences. If we don't have differences, it means that somebody's not thinking. And that's not a fair presumption. But how do we deal with our differences is going to be the key going forward. The thought that I would leave with the membership and whoever is following this with interest is that this process will no doubt be challenging and would require the kind of political vision to be created and reinforced. Political vision about how do we want the WTO of the future to look like. You know, I've said several times, this is not about the future of the WTO, this is about the WTO of the future. Because, and it might look a bit different from this one. This is in the nature of things. So having that political vision is going to be key. And that would require a great deal of thought leadership. It's about thought leadership. When I say leadership, Lou, it's not about the political weight of a hegemonic power. No, I mean, political weight is important, but it's mostly about the thought leadership behind this process. And how do we find the right solutions, and how do we anchor political solutions in sound, substantive, and technical detail workable outcomes. It's not going to be only political, never. You can't cut corners on substance in this system. You cannot. So it has to be where you find the political solutions out of that vision, and how do you anchor those political solutions in sound legal and technical outcomes to take this system forward. So that's the thought that I would leave you with.
Yeah, thank you. And that's also a thought I think should be shared with the ministers and ambassadors for their next work. And especially what you say, that if they don't look at the WTO of the future, then they would risk the future of the WTO, and which of course for us as people committed still to the system is not an ideal situation. So with that, I thank you very much, Hamid, for being with us, and also I thank the audience for bearing with us with so many things. There are a lot of things we have not covered, but of course we will organize a few more interviews in the next few days to cover these things. So thank you a lot, everyone.
Pleasure.
And thanks to Hamid.
Thank you very much, Lou. And as you rightly said now, what we talked about were just the headlines. There's so much to unpack in all of this, and I look forward to our future conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamid.